Welcome to the National Civil Rights Museum's Imagine America podcast. Today's episode is how community collaborations impact justice. And our guests are Eric Cumberbatch and Rayshawn Ray. Eric Cumberbatch is the Senior Vice President of Policy and Community Engagement at the Center for Policing Equity in New York City, whose work is focused on undoing the impact of white supremacy in black communities and placing power in the hands of the most vulnerable people. He has a lifelong dedication to uplifting, organizing, and empowering people, developing creative violence prevention strategies, and improving community cohesion. Rayshawn Ray is the Vice President and Executive Director of the Air Equity Initiative. The initiative works with communities to develop approaches to mitigate the harmful effects of racial segregation and emphasizes workforce development, education, safety, and health equity in communities. As a professor at the University of Maryland and senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, his research focuses on mechanisms that create and maintain racial and social inequity. So you all are researchers and you are in the community. Tell us how that intersection plays itself out when you engage with your constituents.
So I would say community members are the initial researchers. They may not have the actual title or the background in the traditional sense. But when it comes to knowing all about your surroundings, your environment, when it comes to having an understanding of how to engage in the environment, how to build the environment, community members are closest to the issues that we care about. They're the ones that should be brought into the science space to develop their toolkit, to develop their skill set, and be the ones that serve as lead researchers on many of projects that impact their communities.
So thinking about community members, if you will, as data scientists, you as you were talking, it sort of that image came forward. Do you think of them as that way, or do you try to have members of the community think of themselves that way, or is that what role does that play?
I definitely think community members should be empowered to be placed in positions of power and not be the ones that are studied, but the ones that actually are studying their community for the best. I think there's a very unique and innate skill set that already exists that hasn't been validated, that hasn't been necessarily quantified, where folks aren't showing up with the terminology of I'm a researcher or I'm a data scientist or analyst or those things, but their day-to-day actions do reflect that. Yeah. And there's no one better that can give you a holistic, ecological lens, look, and understanding of their community than a lot of the brothers and sisters that are on the ground, that are resilient, and just brilliant in their way of understanding the world and coming up with solutions that actually work. Good example would be before I went to Hopkins, a lot of what I was learning in the classroom was what I was actually practicing already on the ground. I just was practicing this without the terminology, without knowing how this connects back to a more traditional, what we would envision, science field and practice. But I would say people understand their communities better than the researcher. And the traditional lens wants a certain look for a researcher, but I think we have to really acknowledge the brilliance, creativity, wisdom, and experience of people that are on the ground and lift them into the research space as well.
I love that. It sounds like survivalisms and instincts and asset-based analysis, if you will, for our communities.
Absolutely.
And being intentional about that. And I want to turn to Rayshawn and would love for you to talk about when you think over time how we've been able to sort of call on, if you will, these skills and how that plays itself out in the work that you do, and particularly as we think about the lens of civil and human rights today. How have you seen those sort of survivalisms and those skills of people play itself out in your work?
I mean, it's about resiliency. And I think it would be hard to argue, particularly in modern times, a group that's been more resilient than Black Americans in the United States. And we've always done more with less. You look at historically Black colleges and universities, for example, they were not built to survive, but yet they have, right? They came out of the fact that Black people can go to some of the places where we've worked at, some of the places where we've gotten degrees at, but yet and still they survive, and they are thriving, oftentimes producing some of the best minds that the world has ever seen. Imagine what they would do with equitable resources. And a lot of people know that. And part of highlighting this is thinking about the communities in which they come from, because communities create people. And part of thinking about that is lifting up the assets that are oftentimes missed. And part of what's happening now is what I like to call the Black brain drain, that oftentimes individuals who are supposedly the best and the brightest in communities, and typically that just means they're the most prepared to be ready to take on a particular setup in social institutions such as higher education that were not necessarily built for us. And part of thinking about that then is how do we deliver those assets back to those communities to lift them up, to ensure that they're in spaces to be successful. So at the AIR Equity Initiative, we fund research, teaching, evaluation, or technical assistance and evaluation in these local communities to lift up these assets, to produce evidence that can help drive policy. And that starts with people. And whether that's people being credible messengers, whether that's people being activists, whether that is the librarian at the library that is showing off books to kids, whether that's the person at the community center that all the kids look up to who can shoot pool or play basketball the best, but is sitting up reading a book. Those are the type of assets that we want to lift up and that have really created all of us to be here today.
No, I appreciate that. And one of the things that I think we do very well at the National Civil Rights Museum is show some of the nuances, if you will, of the movement, of the historic civil rights movement, and hopefully how that can be applied and utilized today. And with that, it makes me think about the dimensions of the movement. So often, what we highlight are the things that I like to describe it being the merger of the head and the heart. And so often when we are talking about the movement, we focus on the things that speak to the heart. One of the things that intrigues me about the work that you gentlemen do and lead is that you're also very intentional about pulling in the work of the head, if you will. And so how you use data and analysis to help people organize and see the richness of working together. Speak to that, if you will, and how that drives your work.
Yeah, I think we approach, all of the issues that we care about from a holistic lens, and collaboration is key in that process. We want to have multiple levels of stakeholders. We want to be able to share and leverage assets and resources, especially when you're working with communities that might not be resource rich in that sense. So collaboration is critical. Collaboration is key. I think, what we've seen is how do we not only collaborate with like-minded partners, but also where there's tension, and really start to dive into those tension points and find out how we could best still practice and utilize. We could be on parallel tracks. We don't have to necessarily celebrate one another, but we could be on parallel tracks that best serve each other towards a common goal.
That's great. That's great.
I mean, most definitely. I mean, look, data are gold. And part of what data also do is put people oftentimes on the same page in the same book. Part of the problem when we're trying to have conversations with people is people have different narratives. Different groups have different narratives. And oftentimes people are not even in the same book. The data can help us get into the same book and oftentimes on the same page to move forward to have a particular conversation. So part of what we do at the American Institute for Research is we take evidence to use it to drive equity. And we think about these intersections and the holistic way that social life comes together. You know, when we talk about justice and policing, that's not detached from the neighborhoods that people are in. That's not detached from the housing that people live in and the redlining that oftentimes got them there due to segregation. That's not detached from the fact that in those communities, there might be a school that's across the street, or it might be a school that's 5 miles away. Those things structure people's lives. And we want to collect that evidence. We then want to take that evidence and figure out what are the best ways to create prescriptive solutions that are best for everyone. And oftentimes, what it means to be best for everyone is resetting and creating equity points, which means giving people what they need, not necessarily everyone the exact same thing at this point, because there are historical ramifications that have led to where we are today.
Yeah, and the combination of what you both said seems particularly important in this moment as, dare I say, the discomfort of talking about policing on any level. It's more than a hot topic. It's a lightning rod, and it can be alienating if not done with thoughtfulness and skill in the way that you gentlemen do it. How do you factor those dimensions in when you are talking to people about how policing can and should be different?
Yeah, I think the perception is not off. So folks' lived experience with policing is real, and that's a real story. And they should feel the way they do because they've experienced harm. They've experienced pain, whether vicariously or actually to themselves. So that's a legitimate and most rational way of reacting and responding to a stimulus that causes you harm. The process here isn't necessarily to want to become anti anything. It's more so, how do we redesign what public safety looks like and who actually has ownership in that space? How do we blow out the public safety space? So if we look at policing as the only tool that many Black communities are given to respond to any issue, whether it's social services, whether it's health, whether it's mental health crisis, economic issues, then we have law enforcement as the responding tool that comes to us. If we blow this space out and actually start to address root causes, then you'll see a redesign of what public safety looks like, and you will have a right-sized police force that responds to its most violent crimes or its most, high-level issues, instead of quality of life issues, social service issues, being in places where they really have no need to be, and truthfully do not want to be in that space.
Yeah. So that's a dimension that I think perhaps isn't always included in the conversation, is sort of thinking through, and you both do this work, which I think is just takes the knowledge to another level of understanding through the system side of from the police perspective. Excuse me. Rayshawn, could you speak to the work you've done in working with police departments and systems to help with that intersection, if you will, of how we get a better result, if you will, for society at large?
Yeah, most definitely. So at the University of Maryland, where I've been a professor for over a decade, when I was the executive director of the Lab for Applied Social Science Research, we developed a virtual reality training program. And then we started to partner with Google and Jigsaw, which is a subsidiary of Google, to really make it an algorithm that when officers put on the virtual reality goggles, that there's actually an algorithm responding to them in real time based on how the officers are actually acting. Mm-hmm. And so we had to work with police departments from around the country. And not only were we working with them to collect data, to be able to examine those data for biases, for racial and gender and place-based biases, we were also priming the algorithm. Because one thing that we learned is that policing is different for different people. So part of the reason why it's a lightning rod is that people can encounter the same group of cops across town, and that interaction will be significantly different, simply based on where people live and what they look like. We know that. But explaining that to police without crime being attached to it was a problem. So we removed that element from our experimental studies. And part of what we were doing with our training process was to show officers that how they talk to people, their tone of voice, the words they use, their distance from the officers, how they stand, all plays a role in how people react to them, and that they can play a bigger role in escalation and de-escalation than they actually think. And so part of what we found, probably not surprising, is that officers oftentimes exhibit more bias towards black people and primarily black men. But this is where it gets good. We also found that if you prime officers that the person who they are encountering is not a threat and actually might be a victim, all of a sudden the racial differences go away. The problem, however, is that oftentimes we do not have those specific set of interactions, particularly as black men, that no matter where we are and oftentimes no matter what we have on, we're perceived as a threat. And that's because blackness becomes weaponized even when we are unarmed and not attacking, and the research bears that out. But part of what we've done is we also took that, started working with Congress. Anthony Brown led the legislation, and Congress ended up passing a legislation that allows for universities and primarily researchers to partner with police departments to use virtual reality for training of their local police departments. And I think it's a really good example of how you can expose discrimination and bias, but you can say there's a way to correct it, and we need to give police officers the tools in a safe environment where they can't be hurt and where they can't hurt anyone, where they can train to try to reduce those biases.
No, that's really powerful, and thinking about that, I think helps us hopefully imagine that while it's certainly a journey, that there are some solutions that are that can be navigated and figured out in respective communities. I mean, I know you both do very deep work in community and community organizing and community organizers across the country. What are some of the, would you describe if there are some sort of fundamental trends that you see for folks who are in their respective communities trying to make a difference? And I will share my bias and say, as someone who's at the National Civil Rights Museum, I always reference back to the historic civil rights movement and think about some of the dynamics that happened then. Not that the ones today have to model that, but if you were sort of imagining how the current era, how that organizing plays itself out in communities today.
Well, I'll dive into that. I want to touch on the current trend around organizing right now, and what we're seeing is, after the murder of George Floyd, an influx of resources, funding, and support for community-based organizations, organizers, to grow their programs to scale, to build up and actually have the tools to do the work on the ground. That was there. We move forward a couple of years later, we don't see the same funding, we don't see the same support. The people that were marching alongside of organizers and communities are not there. We watch similar atrocities occur across the country. The same energy and emotional outcry from all colors and all people is not the same. And right now we're in a space where we have organizations that have grown, that have produced results, that are quality in everything they do, but they're doing it with less and less every year. And that's the scary part in doing this work. And I think if we draw a comparison, we have very powerful individuals, we have very powerful organizations, but they're not brought to scale at the same levels, rates, and with the same amounts of funding as others. So there's always almost this, I take 3 steps forward and then now I'm right back to square one, and this piggyback back and forth, and that's what we're seeing.
Sure.
Yeah. I mean, to be frank, money's just dried up. And, I think there was a policy window that happened.
Right.
in 2020, right? That was on the heels of Trayvon Martin being killed, with the growth of Black Lives Matter movement, on the heels of Michael Brown, Eric Gardner, others that we can name. And part of what's interesting about that, to Eric's point, these organizations got created, they were getting funded. And not only has it shriveled up, but it's been a complete reversal when we look at the attack on diversity, equity, and inclusion, particularly in higher education. And it's not stopping there. It's spreading to the corporate sector, where it's already went cold for workforce. And what's important about that is that was a space where there were a lot of Black and brown people and women getting access to corporate structures and jobs they didn't previously have. And I think part of what happened, if we go back to 2020, in a sense, the match went out. I think it's like just a little bit there. And unfortunately, incidents like what happens here in Memphis with Tyree Nichols sparks that match back. And I like that analogy, because if people think about a match, sometimes it seems like it's going out and then all of a sudden it just comes back like a candle. And so we see that happening. And what I know from the research I've done, we had a large data set using Twitter data from the time Michael Brown was killed to 1 year later. It's over 30 million tweets. Big thing we found was that people who were saying Black Lives Matter, they were actually mobilizing, they were actually using that to display activism and also highlight the atrocities that were happening to Black people. Simultaneously, there was a counter movement. That counter movement was not all lives matter. That seemed to be something that kind of part of the media kind of helped create as an alternative, but it was actually called TCOT, Top Conservatives on Twitter, which is this kind of amalgamation of conservative viewpoints that came together that has led to these responses. So for example, one thing we know is that when the Ferguson report was issued, showing egregious forms of discrimination in Ferguson, Missouri, where Michael Brown was killed, because that was systemic, right? He was just the catalyst of it. That simultaneously, TCOT was mobilizing to dilute people paying attention to that report and using it. And part of what social media has done, it's been great for mobilizing, great for seeing things, for highlighting top level trends, but not for going really deep, even though people take that and they mobilize offline. But to your point about the civil rights movement, there are a lot of things we can learn from it, including the importance of teach-ins. And I think currently people are starting to realize that, because the gap is not in the mobilization, getting people to protest. People have figured that out. It's about taking that mobilization and protest and turning it into policy, turning it into real political power. Yep. And I think that's where the gap is. And the civil rights movement did that great. And I think people now, interestingly, now that the money is shriveling up, you have a lot of organizations who are saying, okay, maybe we need to consolidate resources. And they are actually coming together to have conversations to think of what are our policy priorities that we can put in place, and what can we learn from people who are in different sectors, so that then we can have these teach-ins to learn how to apply for grants, to learn how to write legislation, to learn how to step into the lion's den and work with people who across the aisle who they may not want to. I mean, for Eric and I mean, we interact with police officers on a regular basis. And there are people in the activist space who might believe similar things to us who would never walk into those spaces. Personally, I find that problematic, because it's hard to come together and move forward unless you're willing to walk in there, but you have to be armed when you walk in there. So the civil rights movement taught us a lot. Yeah. But I do think that the current generation and the generation behind them are looking at this consciously, because an important thing that happened when Obama got elected, for a lot of the young activists today, when Obama got elected, they were children. And society, oftentimes their families, their teachers, told them racism was going away. And here they are, now in their early 20s, and they're like, you all lied to us. And not only did you all lie, it got worse. And not only that, you all didn't prepare us for this moment. And that's the reason why what the National Civil Rights Museum is doing is so important, convening and bringing people together, renovating parts of the museum to not just highlight it up from the 1960s, but to not just act like that since then things have been kumbaya, but to highlight what's happened over the past 50 years or so, to say, what have we learned, what can we gather, and how do we prepare for the next 50 years to try to create racial equity in America?
Yeah, well, thank you for pointing to that. And it does, but what you both said just reinforces in my mind the importance of our work. We have to shine the light on yesterday and make sure people understand and use that for context. But if we stop there, it's incomplete. The relevance wanes. focusing on the last 60 years is really essential, because people have to see themselves, they have to identify, if you will, and then they have to have reason for hope for the future, and that is part of our responsibility. Gentlemen, the work that you do is essential for our country to continue to move forward. I know you change lives every day and help people think about themselves as holders of knowledge, if you will, that can be used in a practical way. It's been a pleasure to be with you all. We appreciate everything you do. Thank you for joining us on this journey.
Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
We encourage our listeners to subscribe to the museum's Imagine in America podcast series and follow the National Civil Rights Museum on our social media platforms. Today's episode is brought to you by the National Civil Rights Museum, located at the Lorraine Motel, the assassination site of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. It chronicles key episodes of the American Civil Rights Movement, examines today's global civil and human rights issues, provokes thoughtful debate, and serves as a catalyst for positive social change.